Helsinki, Finland, January 9, 2007, 6:47 p.m. local time. The conference room on the 8th floor of Nokia House smells like cold coffee and leather briefcases. Outside, snow falls in thick sheets over the city that built the most dominant mobile phone empire the world had ever seen. Inside, 12 men in tailored suits sit in silence, watching a live stream of Steve Jobs on a projector screen. He's wearing his signature black turtleneck, holding a device that looks like a piece of polished glass. The room erupts in laughter. One executive leans back in his chair, arms crossed, a smirk carved into his face. Another shakes his head, muttering something in Finnish that translates roughly to Americans and their toys. The vice president of product strategy scribbles notes on a yellow legal pad. His handwriting is neat, clinical, no physical keyboard, no replaceable battery. $499 with contract. High-end niche only. Someone jokes about how the device won't survive a single drop. They've tested their phones by throwing them against walls, submerging them in water, freezing them in ice. Nokia phones are indestructible. This glass toy from California looks fragile. They're watching the death of their empire in real time. They just don't know it yet. At that exact moment, Nokia wasn't just the largest mobile phone manufacturer on the planet. They were the undisputed king of an industry they invented. 51% of every human being on Earth who owned a mobile phone carried a Nokia device in their pocket. Think about that number. 1 out of every 2 mobile phones sold globally had the Nokia logo on it. Their Symbian operating system powered over 400 million handsets. Their market capitalization sat comfortably at $150 billion, making them one of the most valuable companies in Europe. In Finland, a country of only 5.3 million people, Nokia accounted for 4% of the entire nation's GDP and 70% of the Helsinki Stock Exchange's total value. The company employed over 112,000 people worldwide. They weren't just a corporation. They were a national identity, Finnish pride, the underdog from the frozen north that conquered the world. Nokia's story is the kind of origin myth that business schools worship. Founded in 1865 as a paper mill, the company survived 142 years by constantly reinventing itself. They made rubber boots. They manufactured toilet paper and car tires. They produced television sets and military equipment. In the 1980s, they bet everything on mobile telecommunications, and they won. They had survived the collapse of the Soviet Union, their largest market, in the early 1990s. When the USSR fell, Nokia lost 20% of its revenue overnight. Most companies would have collapsed. Nokia pivoted. They poured resources into Western Europe and Asia. They built the GSM standard that became the global language of mobile networks. They designed phones that were intuitive, reliable, and affordable. By 1998, Nokia had overtaken Motorola as the world's largest mobile phone manufacturer. By 2000, they were selling more phones than everyone else combined. They had crushed Motorola, Ericsson, and every other competitor who dared to challenge them. Nokia's engineers were the best in the world. Their supply chain was a finely tuned machine. Their brand was synonymous with durability. Drop a Nokia 3310 from a 3-story building, and it would survive. The battery lasted a week. The interface was simple. It just worked. Connecting people wasn't just a slogan. It was a global religion. In Africa, Nokia phones brought communication to villages that had never seen electricity. In China, they were status symbols. In Europe, they were ubiquitous. And then a man in California who sold computers stood on a stage and changed everything. Steve Jobs didn't invent the smartphone. IBM did that in 1994 with the Simon Personal Communicator, a brick-sized device that cost $900 and lasted 6 months on the market. BlackBerry owned the business market with their physical keyboards and push email. Palm had the stylus crowd with their PDA phone hybrids. But Jobs did something none of them had the audacity to attempt. He killed the keyboard. He removed the stylus. He bet the future on a piece of multi-touch glass that every expert in the telecom industry said wouldn't work. The mobile carriers hated it. They wanted control over the software, the apps, the entire user experience. Jobs told them no. He dictated terms to AT&T that no manufacturer had ever secured before. Nokia's internal response document, leaked years later, reveals the exact moment they underestimated the threat. The presentation, dated January 2007, acknowledged that the iPhone had a full-fledged internet experience and that Apple's cool factor was a challenge, but buried in the deck was a fatal assumption. Nokia categorized the iPhone as a very high-end device, targeting the top 10% of the market, ultra-premium luxury segment, not mass market. They believed their strength in emerging markets India, China, Africa would insulate them from whatever Apple was doing in Cupertino. They had distribution networks in 160 countries. They sold phones for $30. The iPhone cost $599 unlocked. They were counting bodies. Apple was rewriting the rules of the game. The first-generation iPhone was objectively flawed. It ran on AT&T's sluggish Edge network, not 3G. It couldn't record video. It had no copy and paste function. It couldn't send MMS messages. The battery life was mediocre. Tech reviewers pointed out all of these shortcomings. David Pogue of the New York Times called it revolutionary but noted its limitations. Walt Mossberg praised the interface, but criticized the network speed. Nokia's engineers dissected the device in labs across Finland and found confirmation of what they already believed. The hardware was impressive but not groundbreaking. The software was slick but limited. The iPhone was a luxury toy, a status symbol, not a threat to Nokia's dominance in the mass market. But then something unexpected happened. Developers started building apps. In July 2008, Apple launched the App Store with 500 applications. Within 6 months, there were 15,000 apps. Within a year, 50,000. Within 2 years, over 200,000. The App Store ecosystem exploded. Angry Birds became a cultural phenomenon. Instagram turned everyone into a photographer. Uber reinvented transportation. Spotify changed music. WhatsApp killed SMS. The iPhone wasn't just a phone, it was a platform. A portable computer that fit in your pocket and could run software that Nokia's Symbian OS, with all its bloated, legacy code and carrier restrictions, could never support. Symbian was a Frankenstein operating system. It was built in the late 1990s for devices with physical keyboards and limited memory. Every update required extensive testing across hundreds of different phone models with different screen sizes and hardware configurations. Developers hated working with it. The tools were outdated. The documentation was terrible. The approval process took months. By contrast, Apple offered a clean SDK, robust documentation, and a streamlined approval process. Nokia's leadership faced a choice: abandon Symbian and rebuild from scratch. License Google's Android operating system, which was gaining traction, or double down on what made them dominant. They chose loyalty to a dying system. By 2008, the cracks were visible. Nokia's stock price, which had peaked at over $40 per share in 2000, was hovering around $20. Investors were nervous. Apple's iPhone 3G launched in July 2008 with proper network speeds and the App Store. It sold 1 million units in its first weekend. Demand was so high that Apple couldn't manufacture them fast enough. Samsung began experimenting with Android. The first Android phone, the HTC Dream, launched in October 2008. It was clunky and unpolished, but it had potential. The smartphone war was no longer about hardware specs. It was about software ecosystems, about app stores and developer communities, about creating a platform that third-party creators wanted to build on. Nokia's response was the N97, a device with a physical keyboard and a resistive touchscreen that required a stylus. It was Symbian's flagship answer to the iPhone. It launched in June 2009 with a price tag of $700 unlocked. Critics called it clunky. Users complained about the sluggish interface and constant crashes. Developers ignored it. The N97 sold approximately 2 million units total. The iPhone 3GS launched the same month, sold 1 million units in its first weekend alone, and went on to sell over 20 million devices in its life cycle. The empire was bleeding. Inside Nokia's headquarters, panic was setting in. Middle managers who had warned about the iPhone threat years earlier were suddenly being listened to, but it was too late. The company's structure was the problem. Nokia operated like a collection of feudal kingdoms. The hardware team didn't talk to the software team. The design team was isolated from engineering. Product decisions required approval from multiple layers of bureaucracy. It took Nokia 6 months to approve a software update that Apple could push out in 2 weeks. They had become victims of their own success. The processes that worked when they dominated the market were now strangling them. In September 2010, Nokia hired Stephen Elop, a Canadian executive from Microsoft, as their new CEO. He was the first non-Finnish leader in the company's 145-year history. His mandate was simple: save the sinking ship. What he found inside Nokia was a bureaucracy so calcified that innovation was impossible. Engineers worked in silos. Different departments were building competing products that cannibalized each other. The Symbian team fought with the Mego team. The low-end phone division resented the smartphone division. The company had become so large, so dominant for so long, that it had lost the ability to move fast. They were a supertanker trying to turn in a bathtub. Elop wrote a memo that leaked to the press in February 2011. It became known as the Burning Platform Memo. The title came from a story about a North Sea oil rig worker. In the story, a man stands on an oil rig engulfed in flames. He has 2 choices: stay on the platform and burn alive, or jump 30 meters into freezing water and hope a rescue boat finds him before hypothermia kills him. We too are standing on a burning platform, Elop wrote, and we must decide how we are going to change our behavior. The memo was brutally honest. The first iPhone shipped in 2007, and we still don't have a product that is close to their experience. Android came on the scene just over 2 years ago, and this week they took our leadership position in smartphone volumes. Unbelievable. He acknowledged that Nokia had fallen behind, and that the battle of devices has now become a war of ecosystems. The decision he made was lethal. Instead of adopting Android, the operating system that Samsung was using to devour market share, Elop bet everything on Microsoft's Windows Phone. The logic was strategic. Android was crowded. Samsung, HTC, LG, Motorola, and dozens of Chinese manufacturers were flooding the market with nearly identical devices. Competition was brutal. Margins were thin. Windows Phone, backed by Microsoft's billions, offered exclusivity, a partnership, a chance to be the flagship brand for a third ecosystem. Nokia would be the premier Windows Phone manufacturer. They would get preferential treatment, co-marketing budgets, and engineering support. Wall Street called it insane. Industry analysts called it suicide. Tech journalists called it the worst strategic decision in corporate history. Google had already offered Nokia a sweetheart deal to adopt Android. They would have provided engineering resources, prominent placement in the Google Play Store, and co-marketing support. But Elop believed that Nokia's brand strength, combined with Microsoft's software expertise and enterprise relationships, could claw back lost ground. He believed in differentiation over commoditization. He was wrong. Pause for a moment. Imagine you're sitting in that boardroom in 2011. Your company, which once printed money like a central bank, is hemorrhaging market share every quarter. Your engineers are telling you to go with Android. Your board is divided. The press is circling like vultures. Your stock price has collapsed 60% in 3 years. You've got one shot to make a decision that will either save the company or bury it forever. Do you follow the crowd and adopt Android, knowing you'll be lost in a sea of identical devices competing on price alone? Or do you bet on an unproven platform with the backing of one of the richest companies on earth? What would you do? Answer honestly in the comments below. The Windows Phone partnership launched in October 2011 with the Nokia Lumia 800. It was beautiful. Genuinely, stunningly beautiful. The hardware was flawless. Polycarbonate unibody construction, in bold colors, cyan, magenta, yellow, black. It felt premium. The camera was excellent. The build quality was classic Nokia. The operating system was smooth, elegant, and genuinely innovative with its live tile interface. It was faster than Android. It was more intuitive than Symbian. Reviewers praised the design, but there was one catastrophic problem. No apps. Developers had already chosen iOS and Android as their platforms. The economics were simple. iOS had affluent users who spent money on apps. Android had massive volume and global reach. Windows Phone had neither. It had less than 2% market share. Developers couldn't justify the engineering resources to build a third version of their app for such a small audience. Instagram didn't exist on Windows Phone. Snapchat didn't exist. Major banking apps didn't exist. Google actively sabotaged the platform by refusing to build YouTube, Gmail, or Maps apps. The ecosystem that made smartphones essential was absent. Consumers didn't care how beautiful the hardware was if they couldn't run the software their friends were using. Nokia spent billions on marketing. They ran primetime TV commercials. They partnered with carriers. They slashed prices aggressively. Nothing worked. By 2012, Nokia's smartphone market share had cratered to single digits globally. Android owned 70% of the market. iOS owned 20%. Windows Phone languished at 3%. The company posted a $1 billion operating loss in the second quarter of 2012 alone. They burned through cash reserves at an alarming rate. Credit rating agencies downgraded Nokia's debt to junk status. Stock price collapsed to under $2 per share, down from a peak of $62 in 2000. The Finnish government, watching its largest corporation disintegrate, debated whether to intervene with a taxpayer-funded bailout. Morale inside the company collapsed. Mass layoffs were announced. Entire divisions were shut down. The Symbian team was dissolved. The Mego project was killed. Thousands of engineers who had built the world's dominant mobile platform were fired via email. In September 2013, Microsoft made an offer. They would acquire Nokia's entire mobile phone division for $7.2 billion. It was a fire sale, a humiliation. Nokia's mobile business, which had been valued at over $100 billion at its peak, was being sold for pocket change. The same division that employed 32,000 people worldwide and produced phones that 1.3 billion humans carried was now worth less than Instagram, a photo-sharing app with 13 employees that Facebook had bought for $1 billion the year before. Think about that. Instagram, 13 people, $1 billion. Nokia's mobile division, 32,000 people, $7 billion. The boardroom that had laughed at Steve Jobs 6 years earlier signed the papers in silence. No laughter, no smirks, just the sound of pens scratching signatures and the hum of fluorescent lights. The executives who mocked the iPhone were now updating their LinkedIn profiles. Microsoft inherited a corpse. They rebranded Nokia phones as Microsoft Lumia and continued the Windows Phone experiment. It failed spectacularly. By July 2015, Microsoft wrote off $7.6 billion in impairment charges, effectively admitting the acquisition was a mistake. They laid off 7,800 employees, most of them former Nokia workers. Satya Nadella, Microsoft's new CEO, quietly killed the Windows Phone project. The platform was officially discontinued in 2017 with negligible market share. The App Store was shut down. Support ended. Nokia, meanwhile, retreated into telecommunications infrastructure. They sold their HERE mapping division to a consortium of German automakers, BMW, and Daimler for $3 billion in 2015. They focused on 5G networks, patents, and enterprise solutions. They licensed the Nokia brand to HMD Global, a Finnish company that now makes Android phones under the Nokia name. They survived, but as a shadow of their former glory. The Nokia of today is a telecommunications equipment vendor, respectable, profitable, boring. Today, in January 2026, Nokia's market capitalization sits at $37.3 billion. They're the 631st most valuable company in the world. They provide the invisible backbone of mobile networks. They sell 5G infrastructure to carriers. They license patents. They compete with Ericsson and Huawei for telecom contracts. Apple, the company whose product they dismissed as a toy for rich Americans, is worth $3.63 trillion. It is the most valuable company on earth. The iPhone alone generates more revenue in a single quarter than Nokia's entire market value. Apple sells over 230 million iPhones per year. The iPhone business, if spun off as a separate company, would be the fourth most valuable corporation on the planet. The fall of Nokia is not a story about technology. It's a story about institutional arrogance. About the danger of dominance. About the moment when a company becomes so successful that it confuses market share with invincibility. Nokia didn't fail because they lacked engineers. They had some of the best minds in telecommunications. They invented half the technologies that power modern smartphones. They didn't fail because they lacked money. At their peak in 2007, they were swimming in cash with $12 billion in reserves and no debt. They failed because they stopped listening to the market. They assumed that what worked in 2007 would work in 2010. They believed that consumers wanted physical keyboards because that's what they had always wanted. They thought the iPhone was a niche product because its price point didn't fit their mental model of mass market. They couldn't imagine that people would pay $600 for a phone. But the mass market doesn't care about your mental models. It cares about what solves their problems. And in 2007, the problem wasn't making calls. It was accessing the internet, checking email, taking photos, playing games, and carrying a computer in your pocket. Apple understood that. Nokia didn't. The lesson here is surgical. Success is not a permanent condition. Dominance is not a shield. The same strategies that build empires will eventually destroy them if you refuse to evolve. Nokia ruled the world for over a decade. They survived wars, economic collapses, and technological revolutions. They reinvented themselves multiple times over 142 years, but they couldn't survive their own hubris. They couldn't survive the belief that they were too big, too dominant, too essential to fail. The executives who laughed at Steve Jobs in that Helsinki conference room on January 9, 2007, made a bet. They bet that their experience, their market research, their distribution networks, and their dominance would outlast a computer company's gamble on a keyboard-less phone. They lost that bet, and it cost them everything. If this story proved to you that arrogance is more dangerous than competition, that legacy dies the moment you stop adapting, and that the giants who refuse to listen will always fall, then you need to be part of this community. Subscribe to Unstoppable, turn on notifications, and share this with someone who thinks their success is permanent, because the market doesn't care about your history. It only cares about what you do next.